They said she carried something worse than dirt, something that could stain a man just by standing too close. The wind moved slow through the main street that afternoon, dragging dust across worn wooden boards and rattling a loose sign that hadn't been fixed in years. And at the far edge of it all, where the sunlight didn't quite reach, she stood like she always did, half hidden, half forgotten, Eliza Crow, wrapped in a faded shawl that had seen too many seasons and not enough kindness, her hands covered even in the heat. Thin fabric tied tight around her fingers as if skin itself had become something dangerous, and nobody asked why anymore. Because in a place like this, questions turned into stories, and stories turned into truth whether they deserved it or not. And the truth about Eliza, at least the one people chose to believe, was simple. She was unclean, not just in body, but in something deeper, something they couldn't name but felt safe fearing. So they kept their distance, a full 10 feet if they could help it. Mothers pulling children back without a word, men turning their shoulders as she passed, as if the very air around her had gone bad. And she never argued, never raised her voice, just lowered her eyes and stepped further out of the light, like she was agreeing with them, like she had accepted the story they wrote about her without ever being asked to speak her own. And that was the part that unsettled Caleb Whitmore more than anything. Not the whispers, not the distance, but the way she believed it too. Because he had seen people lie, had heard men twist truth into something easier to carry, but he had rarely seen someone carry a lie about themselves so quietly, so completely, like it had weight, like it pressed down on her shoulders every time she moved. And he noticed things others didn't, small things, the way she paused near the water barrel but never touched it, waiting until everyone else walked away, the way she left coins on the counter at the general store without ever stepping inside, how the shopkeeper would take them with 2 fingers like he was handling something fragile and unwanted at the same time, and how she never stayed long enough to see his face, just turned and walked back into that edge of shadow where she seemed to belong. And Caleb had been watching all of it for 3 days now, leaning against the post outside the saloon, hat low, saying nothing, because out here words came cheap, but actions cost something. And he wasn't a man who spent either without reason, but something about her didn't sit right with him, not the way the town spoke about her, not the way she moved like she was trying to take up less space than a person should, and especially not the way she flinched at the sound of boots getting too close, like she expected something worse than silence. And then it happened, not loud, not dramatic, just a misstep on uneven boards outside the saloon, a shift of weight, a heel catching on splintered wood, and suddenly she was on the ground, palms pressed against dust that clung to her like it had been waiting for her all along. And for a second everything paused, not out of concern, but out of habit, because people here didn't rush to help her. They watched, they always watched, and she didn't look up, didn't call out, just whispered it, soft enough that most wouldn't hear, but Caleb did. "I'm filthy, don't touch me." And it wasn't a warning, not really. It was a confession, one she had repeated so many times it had become the only truth she trusted. And the men near the door shifted, one of them letting out a quiet laugh, not cruel, just comfortable, like this was how things were supposed to go, like the world made sense this way. And Caleb straightened, slow, deliberate, the kind of movement that made people notice without knowing why. And he stepped off the post, boots hitting the ground with a dull thud that carried farther than it should have. And as he walked toward her, the street began to change, conversations thinning out, eyes turning, because they knew him, knew the kind of man he was, quiet, steady, not one to stir trouble. And that made this different, made this wrong somehow, because he wasn't supposed to step into stories like hers, wasn't supposed to cross lines that everyone else had agreed to keep. And still he kept walking, past the men, past the looks, until he stood just a few feet from her, close enough now to see the tremble in her hands, the way she tried to pull them in, hide them even in the dirt, like they were something shameful. And for a moment he said nothing, just stood there with the sun cutting across his shoulders and the shadow still holding her where she lay. And then, slowly, he reached up, fingers brushing the edge of his worn leather gloves, and began to pull them off, one at a time. And that was when the silence truly settled, not the usual kind, but something heavier, something that stretched across the street and held every breath in place. Because out here, a man didn't take off his gloves unless he meant to touch something real. and nobody in that town had touched Eliza Crow in a long, long time. Caleb Whitmore did not rush the moment, because men who rushed usually carried doubt, and he had none, not in his hands, not in his eyes, not in the quiet weight of the choice he had already made. And as the second glove slipped free and fell into the dust beside his boot, a low murmur moved through the street like wine through dry grass, subtle but restless, because this was not how things were done here. Not in this town where distance meant safety and silence meant agreement. And yet there he was, standing within arm's reach of the one person everyone else had learned to avoid. And Eliza Crow felt it before she saw it. That shift in the air, that closeness, and her shoulders tightened as if bracing for something she could not name, her voice barely more than breath as she said it again, softer this time, almost pleading, "Do not, please, do not touch me." And it was not fear of him that trembled in those words, but something deeper, something worn thin by time, like a belief that had been repeated too often to question, and Caleb heard it, every piece of it, the warning, the shame, the quiet surrender, and still he moved, lowering himself to one knee so that he was not standing over her, but beside her, equal in the dust, equal in the light that barely reached her where she knelt, and his hand hovered there for a moment, not hesitating, just giving the world one last chance to stop him. And when it did not, when no voice came forward strong enough to carry truth instead of rumor, he closed that distance, his bare hand finding hers through the thin wrap of fabric, steady, firm, without force, without hesitation, and the contact was simple, almost nothing, skin through cloth, warmth meeting warmth, but it struck the street like thunder held in silence, because no one had seen it happen before, not here, not to her, and Eliza froze, her breath catching somewhere between disbelief and something far more fragile, her fingers stiff at first as if they did not remember how to respond, and then slowly, almost against her will, they softened, not gripping back, not pulling away, just existing in that space where someone had decided she was not something to avoid, and the town watched, every pair of eyes fixed on that single point of contact, because they had been certain of something, certain for so long that it had become law, without being written, and now that certainty had been touched, questioned, undone by a man who had said nothing at all, and one of the men by the saloon door shifted his weight, clearing his throat like he might speak, but the words never came, because even he could not find a reason strong enough to stand against what he was seeing, and Caleb did not look at them, did not search for approval or challenge, his focus never leaving her, his voice low when he finally spoke, not loud enough to carry far, but enough for her to hear. "You have been standing alone too long." And it was not a question, not an accusation, just a statement placed gently between them, and Eliza's eyes lifted then, slow, uncertain, meeting his for the first time not as something to be avoided, but as something to be seen. And there was confusion there, yes, and fear that had not yet decided to leave, but beneath it something else began to surface, something that had not been given space in a long while. Something like doubt in the story she had been told about herself, and she shook her head once, small, almost automatic. "You do not understand," she whispered, because that was easier, because that kept things where they belonged, and Caleb gave the faintest nod, like he accepted that he did not, like he did not need to, his thumb brushing lightly against the edge of the cloth around her hand, not to test, not to prove, just to show that nothing happened, that the world did not break, that the sky did not fall, that he was still there, unchanged, unafraid, and the silence stretched again, longer this time, deeper, pulling everyone into it whether they wanted to be or not, because something had shifted and they could feel it, not in words, not in reason, but in the simple fact that a line had been crossed and nothing terrible had followed. And across the street an older woman lowered the hand she had kept pressed against her chest, her eyes narrowing not in anger, but in uncertainty, as if she was seeing something she had not expected to see. And a boy who had once thrown a pebble in Eliza's direction stood still now, his fingers empty, unsure what to do with them, and Caleb slowly helped her to her feet, not pulling, not forcing, just offering steadiness until she found it on her own. And when she stood there beside him, still wrapped in that worn shawl, still marked by every whisper the town had ever given her, something about her posture had changed, barely noticeable, but there, like a weight had shifted just enough to let her breathe differently. And Caleb stepped back then, not to distance himself, but to give her space that did not feel like exile. And for the first time since she had fallen, she did not move immediately toward the edge of the street, did not retreat into shadow. She just stood there, in the open, in the same light as everyone else. And that alone unsettled the town more than anything that had come before, because it was one thing to avoid her when she stayed where they expected, it was another to see her where she did not belong anymore, not in their version of things, not in the story they had built. And as Caleb reached down to pick up his gloves from the dust, brushing them once against his palm, he finally looked up, not at her, but at them, at every face that had chosen silence over truth for longer than they could remember. And he did not speak, did not challenge, did not accuse, because he did not need to. The question was already there, hanging in the air between them, heavier than any words he could have used, and none of them were ready to answer it. The street did not return to normal, because something like that does not simply fade. It lingers, it sits in the air like dust that refuses to settle. And even as boots shifted and doors creaked open again, no one moved quite the same. No one spoke with the same certainty they had carried just minutes before, and Eliza felt it in the way the space around her changed. Not wider, not tighter, just different. Like the ground beneath her feet had decided to hold her instead of push her away. And that alone made her uneasy, because she did not know how to stand in a place that no longer rejected her. And she looked down at her hand, still wrapped, still marked by everything she had been told, and yet it no longer felt like something dangerous. Not after what had just happened, not after someone had reached for it without fear, and her fingers moved slightly beneath the cloth, testing something she had not tested in a long time. And Caleb noticed, not with his eyes, but with that quiet awareness he carried, the kind that did not need to stare to understand. And he slipped his gloves back on slowly, not because he needed them now, but because the moment had passed, and he knew better than to hold it longer than it needed to be held. And across the street the saloon door swung open again, a man stepping out with a hesitant glance, like he expected the world to correct itself the second he looked away, but it did not. Eliza was still there, still standing where she had never been, allowed to stand before, and Caleb turned slightly, giving her a path if she wanted it, not leading, not guiding, just opening space. And for a second she did not move, caught between what she had always done and what she might do now. And the silence stretched just enough for the choice to matter. And then she took one step forward, not toward the edge, not toward shadow, but straight ahead, into the open stretch of street, where the sun fell without hesitation. And it was a small step, measured, uncertain, but it carried more weight than anything that had happened before, because it was hers, not forced, not pulled, and the sound of it, soft against the wooden boards, echoed louder than it should have, drawing eyes again, drawing attention she had spent years trying to avoid. And this time she did not lower her head immediately, did not shrink away. She simply kept moving, one step, then another, as if she was learning the shape of the street all over again. And Caleb remained where he was, watching not with pride, not with expectation, but with a quiet steadiness that did not ask for anything in return. And a woman near the general store shifted her stance, her hand tightening around the edge of the doorframe as she watched Eliza pass closer than she ever had before, close enough now that the distance they once kept felt like something chosen, not something required. And the woman did not step back. Not this time. She held her ground, uncertain, conflicted, but still there. And that was enough to change something. Not loudly, not completely, but enough. And Eliza felt it as she passed, the absence of that immediate retreat, the absence of that sharp turn away, and it slowed her for just a moment, just long enough to notice, just long enough to wonder if the story she had been living inside was beginning to loosen its grip. And she stopped near the water barrel, the same one she had circled for weeks without touching, and her eyes rested on it like it was something distant, something out of reach. And the town watched again, quieter this time, not waiting for spectacle, but for something smaller, something that felt somehow more important. And her hand lifted, slow, hesitant, the cloth still wrapped around it. And for a moment it hovered there, suspended between what she believed and what she had just felt. And then, with a breath that barely moved her shoulders, she lowered it, letting her fingers rest against the wood, not fully, not with confidence, but enough to feel it, enough to know it was real, and nothing happened. No sudden gasp, no voice shouting warning, just the quiet continuation of a world that had not ended. And that was the moment the doubt settled in. Not loud, not clear, but present. A thin crack in something that had once felt unbreakable. And behind her, Caleb shifted his weight slightly, not stepping closer, not stepping away, just remaining, a presence without pressure, and the town began to move again, slowly, carefully, like people testing a bridge they were not sure would hold. And somewhere a chair scraped, somewhere a door closed, and the ordinary sounds returned. But they carried a different tone now, less certain, less fixed, and Eliza stood there a moment longer before pulling her hand back, looking at it as if it might tell her something new, something true. And when she turned, her eyes found Caleb again, not with fear, not with apology, but with a quiet question she had not yet learned how to ask, and he did not answer it, not with words, not with gestures, just a small nod, almost imperceptible, like he was acknowledging something she had not yet named. And then he turned his gaze away, giving her the one thing no one else had thought to give her before, the freedom to decide what came next. The afternoon did not forget what had happened. It stretched it, carried it forward in every glance and every pause. And by the time the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street, the story had already begun to change shape, not in words, not yet, but in the way people moved around her, slower, more careful, like they were stepping around something fragile instead of something to be avoided. And Eliza felt that shift with every step she took away from the water barrel, her fingers still tingling beneath the cloth, not from pain, not from anything she had been warned about, but from the absence of it, from the quiet realization that nothing terrible had followed her touch. And that absence felt louder than any warning she had ever believed, and she walked further than she usually allowed herself, past the edge where she would normally turn back, past the familiar line of safety she had drawn for herself over months, maybe years, until she found herself standing near the general store door, close enough now to hear the creak of its hinges, close enough to see her reflection faintly in the dusty glass. And she stopped there, her breath shallow, her eyes searching that reflection like it might reveal something new. But it showed the same face, the same tired eyes, the same worn shawl, and yet it did not feel the same. And inside the store, the shopkeeper stood behind the counter, watching, his hands resting flat against the wood as if he needed the support. His gaze not hard, not welcoming, just uncertain, caught between what he had always believed and what he had just witnessed. And for a long moment neither of them moved, the distance between them filled with everything that had never been said. And then Eliza reached into her pocket, her fingers closing around a few coins, worn and smooth from use, and she placed them carefully on the small ledge outside the door, the same way she always had, the same quiet routine that had kept her separate from everyone else. And she turned, slightly, already preparing to leave, already slipping back into the pattern that had defined her place in this town. But something stopped her, not a voice, not a hand, just a memory of warmth through cloth, a moment that had not followed the rules she had lived by. And she hesitated, her hands still near the coins, her eyes lifting once more toward the doorway. And inside, the shopkeeper shifted, his fingers curling slightly against the counter, as if he was holding on to something that was starting to slip. And for the first time since anyone could remember, he took a step forward, slow, deliberate, each movement carrying more weight than it should have, until he stood just inside the threshold, not crossing it, not yet, but closer than he had ever been. And he looked at the coins, then at her, and his voice, when it came, was quieter than usual, stripped of the certainty it once held. You can come in," he said, the words awkward, unfamiliar, like they did not quite belong to him yet. And the street seemed to hold its breath again, not as sharply as before, but enough to be felt, enough to matter. And Eliza did not move right away, her eyes fixed on him as if trying to understand what he meant, as if the words themselves were something new, something she had never been offered before. And for a moment it looked like she might turn away, like she might retreat back into the safety of distance where nothing unexpected could happen. But then she remembered that hand, that quiet steadiness, and the way nothing had gone wrong. And she took a step forward, just one, closing the smallest part of the distance between them. And the shopkeeper did not step back, did not raise his hands, did not look away. He simply stood there, waiting, and that waiting carried more respect than any apology could have. And Eliza crossed the threshold, slowly, cautiously, like she was entering a place she had only ever seen from the outside. And the bell above the door gave a soft ring, a small sound that echoed louder than it should have, marking a moment the town would not easily forget. And outside, Caleb Whitmore remained where he had been, leaning once more against the post, his hat low, his gaze distant now, as if what he had done no longer belonged to him, as if it had been given back to the town to decide what to do with. And one by one, the people who had watched began to turn away, not because the moment had ended, but because it had settled into something they would have to carry, something that would not leave just because they chose not to look at it. And inside the store, Eliza stood still for a second longer, her hand hovering uncertainly at her side, before she slowly began to unwrap the cloth from her fingers, not all at once, not fully, just enough to let the air touch skin that had been hidden for too long. And when nothing happened, when the world remained steady and unchanged, she let out a breath she did not realize she had been holding. And somewhere in that quiet space, something began to shift for good, not loudly, not completely, but enough that it could not be undone. And outside, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows stretched longer, the town of silent judgments found itself standing in a silence of a different kind, one that did not come from certainty, but from the slow, uncomfortable beginning of understanding. Inside the store, the air felt different, not cleaner, not warmer, just unfamiliar in a way that made every small movement carry weight. And Eliza stood near the doorway for a moment longer than necessary, as if the wooden floor beneath her boots needed time to accept her presence. And the shopkeeper watched her with a gaze that had lost its edge, replaced now by something quieter, something uncertain, and he reached for a small sack on the counter, his hands moving slower than usual, as though each motion required thought he had never needed before. And he set it down carefully, closer to her than he had ever dared, not sliding it across, not avoiding contact, just placing it there and stepping back a single inch. A gesture so small it might have gone unnoticed on any other day, but not this one, not now. And Eliza's eyes followed that movement, her breath steady but shallow, her fingers still partially unwrapped, pale against the dim light that filtered through the window. And she moved forward, not quickly, not with confidence, but with a quiet determination that had begun to take root somewhere deep inside her. And when her hand reached for the sack, she did not cover it again. She did not hide behind the cloth. She simply touched it, bare, and the world did not change. The walls did not close in. The man behind the counter did not recoil, and that absence spoke louder than anything else could have. And she held that moment longer than needed, her fingertips resting against the rough fabric as if confirming it was real, as if confirming she was still allowed to be there. And outside, the street had not returned to its old rhythm. It had softened, slowed, like a place that had realized it had been wrong but did not yet know how to say it. And Caleb Whitmore remained against the post, his presence steady but distant, as though he had stepped out of the moment the second it no longer needed him, his eyes tracing the edges of the town without settling, without claiming anything. That followed, and a few men passed by, their boots quieter than before, their glances shorter, less certain, and one of them paused near the door, his hand lifting slightly, as if he meant to say something, but the words never came. They stayed where so many other things had stayed, caught between what was easy and what was right. And inside, Eliza drew her hand back slowly, holding the small sack close to her chest, not as something to hide, but as something to keep. And for the first time since anyone could remember, she did not turn immediately toward the exit, did not slip back into the space where she had always been allowed to exist. Instead, she looked around, really looked at the shelves, at the light, at the small details that had always been just out of reach. And there was something in her eyes now that had not been there before, not quite hope, not yet, but the beginning of it, fragile and quiet, like a flame that had just been lit and did not yet know if it would last. And the shopkeeper cleared his throat softly, not to rush her, not to break the moment, just to fill the space with something human, something that did not push her away. And he nodded once. Simple gesture that carried more meaning than any apology could have held, and Eliza returned it, just as small, just as careful, and then she turned, stepping back toward the door, but this time the movement was different, not retreating, not escaping, just leaving, like anyone else might. And when she stepped out into the fading light, the town did not pull away from her. It did not close in. It simply watched, quieter than before, more aware, and Caleb lifted his gaze slightly, just enough, saying the wrong things all along. The road stretched out ahead of her, long and open, the kind that did not promise anything but gave space enough to decide what came next, and Eliza walked it slowly, the small sack held close, her steps measured not by fear anymore, but by something new, something uncertain and steady at the same time. And behind her the town did not call her back, did not stop her. It simply remained where it had always been. Only now it felt smaller, quieter, like it had lost the weight it once held over her. And the evening light followed her as she moved, brushing gold across the dust, catching in the strands of her hair, softening the edges of everything she had once tried to hide. And she lifted her hand again, the cloth now loosened, barely clinging to her fingers. And for a moment she hesitated, not because she feared what would happen, but because she had lived so long believing something would. And that kind of belief does not disappear all at once. It fades, slowly, like a shadow pulling back from the sun, and she began to unwrap it fully, one turn at a time, each layer falling away like a piece of something she no longer needed, until her hand was bare, completely bare, open to the air, open to the light. And she stopped walking then, holding it out slightly in front of her as if it belonged to someone else, as if she was seeing it for the first time, and nothing changed, no sign, no signal, just the quiet presence of her own skin where she had been told danger lived, and she let out a breath, deeper this time, fuller, like it had been waiting for permission to leave her chest. And far behind her Caleb Whitmore finally moved, not quickly, not to follow, just a shift of weight as he stepped away from the post, his boots pressing into the same ground that had held so many quiet judgments before, and he walked toward the hitching rail where his horse waited, the animal lifting its head slightly as he approached, calm, unbothered, as if it had witnessed none of what had just passed. And Caleb rested a hand on the saddle, his gaze drifting once more down the road where Eliza had gone, not to check, not to measure, just to see. And there was no pride in his expression, no sense of having done something worth remembering, only a quiet understanding that some things were not meant to be held on to, only set in motion. And back in the town, the changes continued in small ways, the kind that would have gone unnoticed before, the kind that mattered more now. The woman at the doorway no longer pulled her shawl tighter when someone passed too close. The boy who once threw stones now kicked at the dust instead, his hands unsure what to do without the certainty he had been given. And the shopkeeper stood at his counter longer than usual, staring at the space where Eliza had stood, his fingers tapping lightly against the wood, as if trying to make sense of something that no longer fit the shape of what he had believed. And no one spoke of it, not directly, not yet. But the silence had changed. It was no longer empty. It was full of something waiting, something growing, and out. On the road, Eliza began to walk again, slower now, not because she was tired, but because she no longer needed to hurry away from anything, and the land around her opened wider with each step, the town shrinking behind her not as a place she had escaped, but as a place she had outgrown. And she looked down at her hand one last time, turning it slightly in the light, her fingers flexing as if remembering what they were meant to do. And then she lowered it to her side, natural, unhidden, part of her again in a way it had not been for a long time. And somewhere in that quiet stretch of road, with the sky beginning to shift toward evening, she realized something she had not allowed herself to consider before, that maybe the dirt had never been hers to carry, that maybe the weight she had been holding all this time did not belong to her at all. And she did not smile, not yet. Not fully, but there was a softness at the edge of her expression, something lighter than before, something that did not press down on her the way it once had. And she kept walking, forward, into whatever waited beyond the horizon, while behind her, in a town that had finally begun to listen, the silence held not judgment, but the quiet beginning of change. Morning did not arrive all at once. It eased its way over the hills, pale light stretching across the land like a careful hand. And Eliza felt it before she opened her eyes, that quiet warmth settling over her where she had rested beside the road. Not far, not lost, just far enough that the town no longer filled her thoughts the way it once had. And for a moment she lay still, listening, not for voices, not for warnings, but for something she had forgotten how to hear, the simple sound of nothing pressing against her. And when she sat up, the world looked the same as it always had. Dust, sky, distant trees, but it did not feel the same. It did not carry the weight she had been used to, and she lifted her hand again, almost without thinking, turning it slowly in the early light. Her fingers steady now, no cloth, no barrier, just skin and air and the quiet realization that it had always been enough. And she stood, brushing dust from her skirt, the small sack still tied and resting at her side, and she began to walk again, not toward anything she could name, just forward, because forward no longer felt like escape. It felt like choice. And back in the town the morning came with its own kind of hesitation. Doors opened slower, boots hit the ground softer, and people looked at one another with something new behind their eyes. Not accusation, not agreement, but uncertainty. The kind that asks questions instead of answering them. And Caleb Whitmore had not left. Not yet. He had stayed through the night without making a point of it, his horse tied, his place chosen not at the center but just off to the side, where he could see without being seen. And when the first light reached him, he adjusted his hat and stepped out into the street, not searching, not expecting, just moving like a man who understood that some things unfold on their own time. And the shopkeeper was already awake, standing outside his door with a cloth in hand he had not used, his gaze drifting down the road where Eliza had walked the day before, as if something in him had not quite settled. And he noticed Caleb then, gave a small nod, not the kind that came from habit, but the kind that came from recognition, from understanding that something had changed between them all. And Caleb returned it just as quietly, because nothing needed to be said, not yet. And a few others gathered slowly, not in a group, not with purpose, just drawn by something they could not name, standing near doorways, near fences, each holding their own thoughts, their own version of what had happened, and none of them spoke it out loud, because speaking would make it real, and they were not sure they were ready for that. And then, far down the road, where the light had fully settled, a figure moved, small at first, almost part of the land itself, but steady, unmistakable, and someone noticed, then another, until the quiet shifted again, not with fear this time, but with attention, and Eliza walked back toward the town, not quickly, not uncertainly, just with the same measured steps she had taken when she left, her hand uncovered, her posture no longer pulled inward, and as she drew closer, the distance that once kept her apart did not return. It held, open, waiting, and she felt it as she stepped onto the edge of the street again, felt the absence of that invisible line she had never been allowed to cross before. And no one moved away, no one stepped back. They simply watched, not judging, not welcoming, just seeing. And that alone carried more meaning than anything they could have said. And she continued forward, past the same places, the same doors, the same faces, but nothing sat the same anymore. Nothing pressed her back into the role she had carried for so long. And Caleb stood where the road met the street, his presence steady, unchanged. And when she reached him, she did not stop out of fear. She stopped because she chose to, her eyes meeting his with something clearer now, something that had found its shape overnight. And for a moment they said nothing, because the silence between them no longer needed to be filled. And then she spoke, her voice still soft, but no longer carrying that same weight. It was never there, was it? And it was not a question meant for him alone. It was something she had finally allowed herself to ask, and Caleb gave a slight tilt of his head, not confirming, not denying, just letting the truth sit where it belonged, not in words, but in what she had already seen. And she nodded once, slow, steady, like she understood now, like she had always known somewhere beneath everything she had been told. And she stepped past him then, not as someone leaving, not as someone returning, just as someone moving forward in a place that had finally made room for her. And the town watched her go, not in silence this time, but in something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of change, quiet, incomplete, but real. and Caleb remained where he was, his gaze following her only for a moment before lifting to the street, to the people, to the space that had once been so certain and was now something else entirely. And he did not smile, did not claim anything. He simply stood there, a man who had done what needed doing and asked for nothing in return, and in that stillness, the town began to understand that what had changed was not her, not really, it was them. The town did not speak of what had changed, not in words anyone could hear, but it showed itself in smaller things, quieter things, the kind that settled deep and stayed, and Eliza felt it as she walked past the same buildings that had once turned their backs on her, the same windows that had once reflected her like something out of place, and now they simply reflected her as she was, nothing more, nothing less, and that difference, subtle as it was, carried farther than any apology could have reached, and she moved through it without rushing, without shrinking, her step steady, her gaze no longer fixed on the ground. And there was a stillness in her now that had not been there before, not the stillness of fear, but the kind that comes when something inside you finally stops running. And the people watched her pass, not all of them, not openly, but enough that she could feel it. And this time it did not push her away. It held, uncertain, yes, but open, and the woman who had once stood rigid in the doorway of the general store now leaned lightly against the frame, her hands resting at her sides. Not gripping, not bracing, just there. And when Eliza passed within arm's reach, the distance that once would have been filled with tension remained empty. No sudden step back, no sharp breath, just the quiet acknowledgement of space shared. And Eliza noticed, not with surprise, but with a calm awareness, as if she had already begun to expect something different, and she slowed slightly, not stopping, just enough to let the moment settle between them, and the woman gave the smallest nod, barely more than a shift of her chin, but it was there, and Eliza returned it without thinking, the gesture natural, unforced, like something she had done all her life, though she had not here, not in this place. And further down the street, the boy who had once filled his hands with stones now stood near the water barrel, his fingers tracing the edge of the wood in the same way she had done the day before. And when he saw her, he did not look away, he did not hide. He simply watched, curious now instead of certain, and as she approached, he stepped back, not out of fear, but to give her space, and that difference mattered. It mattered in a way that could not be measured, only felt, and Eliza reached the barrel again, the same one that had marked the turning point, and she paused, her hand lifting without hesitation this time, resting against the wood as if it had always belonged there. And she drew water, simple, ordinary, the kind of act no one else had ever thought twice about. And when she raised the cup, her fingers steady around it, the street held its breath for just a second, not in fear, not in expectation of something going wrong, but in recognition of something going right. And she drank, slowly, calmly, the water catching the light as it moved, and nothing changed, nothing broke. The world remained exactly as it was. Only now it included her in a way it never had before. And across the street Caleb Whitmore stood near his horse, his hand resting loosely on the saddle, his gaze drifting without settling. And he did not watch her closely, did not mark each step, because he did not need to. The moment had already passed into something larger than either of them, and he understood that what came next did not belong to him. And a man stepped out from the saloon then, one who had laughed before, one who had stayed silent when it mattered, and he paused on the steps, his eyes moving from Eliza to Caleb and back again. And for a moment it looked like he might speak, like he might try to fill the space with something that would make sense of it all. But he did not. He only stood there, his hat low, his shoulders less certain than they had been the day before. And that silence, that refusal to return to what had been easy, was its own kind of change. And Eliza lowered the cup, her hand steady, her breath even, and she set it back where it belonged, not carefully, not cautiously, just as anyone would. And she turned then, not toward the edge of town, not toward the road she had taken before, but deeper into the street, into the center of it, where everything had once been closed to her. And she walked there without hesitation, her steps sure, her presence no longer something to be avoided. And as she passed Caleb, she did not stop, did not look for confirmation. She simply moved forward, and he gave a slight nod, almost to himself, as if acknowledging something that had already taken root, and the town, still quiet, still learning, watched her go, not as something apart, but as someone who had always belonged and was only now being seen that way. And in that quiet, in that slow unfolding, something settled into place, not perfectly, not completely, but enough that it would not be undone by the next whisper, enough that it would remain when the dust rose again and the wind carried new stories through the street. And Eliza walked on, her hand uncovered, her steps steady, her place no longer at the edge, and behind her, the town began, in its own quiet way, to follow. By midday the town had begun to move again in ways that felt almost familiar, but not quite, as if every step carried a memory of what had been and a question of what might be. And Eliza walked through it with a quiet steadiness that no longer asked permission, her presence no longer slipping along the edges but settling into the spaces that had once been closed, and people adjusted around her without realizing it, a shoulder turning just enough to allow her passage, a glance held a second longer before looking away, not in avoidance, but in thought. And these were small things, nearly invisible, but they gathered, one by one, until the street itself felt different beneath her feet, and she noticed it in the way the air no longer pressed against her, no longer carried that weight of expectation that had once followed her like a shadow. And she reached the far end of the street where the buildings thinned and the land opened again, and for a moment she paused, not because she needed to leave, but because she could, because the road was no longer the only place that would take her, and that choice settled in her chest like something new, something steady, and she turned back, slowly, her eyes tracing the line of the town from one end to the other, seeing it not as a barrier, not as something to pass through, but as a place she could stand within. And that simple shift held more power than anything that had come before, and behind her the sound of hooves moved softly against the ground. Caleb Whitmore guiding his horse forward at an easy pace, not catching up, not falling behind, just moving along the same path without closing the distance. And when he reached the point where the road met the street, he stopped, resting a hand against the saddle as he watched her turn, and there was no question in his gaze, no need to ask what she would do next, because he understood that whatever came now belonged to her alone. And she met his eyes for a moment, not searching, not uncertain, just acknowledging. And then she stepped back into the town once more, not as someone testing the ground, but as someone who knew it would hold. And the shift that followed was quiet but undeniable. A man who had once stood with his back turned now faced forward, his posture no longer closed. A woman who had once avoided the center of the street now crossed it without hesitation, as if something in her had loosened as well. And the boy by the barrel filled a cup and drank without looking around first, as if he no longer expected the world to react to something so simple. And Eliza moved among them, not watched as closely now, not followed by the same weight of attention, because what had once been a moment had begun to settle into something lasting, something that did not need to be repeated to be believed. And she stopped near the center, where the sun fell strongest, where there was no shadow to step into. And she stood there, her hands at her sides, her shoulders relaxed, her breath even. And for a moment it seemed as though the entire town paused with her, not out of habit, not out of fear, but out of recognition. And the silence that formed was not empty. It was full of everything that had shifted and everything that still needed to. And Caleb remained where he was, his presence steady at the edge, not stepping in, not stepping away, because he knew that some things were not meant to be guided, only witnessed. And the town began to move again, slowly, naturally, not returning to what it had been, but continuing forward into something new, something uncertain but no longer resisted. And Eliza felt it in the way the space around her no longer tightened, in the way her own steps no longer hesitated. And she took another breath, deeper this time, letting it settle, letting it remain. And when she looked ahead, she did not see the road as an escape. She saw it as one of many directions she could choose, and that was enough. Enough to stand, enough to stay, enough to move when she wished. And as the sun climbed higher and the day carried on, the town did not return to its old ways. Not completely, not perfectly, but it did not need to, because something had already taken root, something quiet and steady, something that would remain long after the dust had settled. And Eliza walked forward once more, not toward the edge, not toward the road, but through the heart of it all, where she had never been allowed to belong. And this time, no one tried to take that away. The sun stood high now, pressing its light evenly across the town as if nothing had ever been hidden beneath shadow, and Eliza moved through it without hesitation, her steps no longer measured by where she was allowed to be, but by where she chose to go, and that difference, though quiet, reshaped everything around her, because people could feel it, even if they could not name it. They could feel that something had shifted beyond their control, beyond their old stories, and the space she occupied no longer bent away from her. It held, steady, open, as if it had always been meant to. And she passed the saloon again, the same doorway where laughter had once followed her like an echo. And now the men inside fell quiet as she crossed in front, not out of guilt alone, but out of something closer to reflection, the kind that makes a man look inward instead of outward. And one of them lowered his glass slowly, his eyes tracking her movement with a softness that had not been there before, not kindness yet, not fully, but something that could become it, given time, and that was enough. And Eliza did not stop, did not acknowledge it directly, because she no longer needed their approval to continue. And further along the street, the general store door remained open, the bell above it still, as if waiting, and she paused there again, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, because this place, more than any other, had marked the line she had crossed, and she stepped inside without hesitation, her hand brushing lightly against the doorframe as she passed. And the shopkeeper looked up from behind the counter, his expression steady now, no longer caught between belief and doubt, but settled somewhere new, somewhere quieter, and he gave her a nod that did not feel forced, did not feel like an apology, just acknowledgement, simple and real, and she returned it the same way, her movement natural, unguarded, and she moved toward the shelves, her fingers trailing lightly along the edges of items she had never allowed herself to touch before, not with caution, not with fear, just with quiet curiosity. And outside, Caleb Whitmore had mounted his horse, his posture relaxed, his presence already beginning to pull away from the center of things, because he understood that staying too long would change the meaning of what had been done, and he had never been a man who lingered where he was no longer needed. And he turned the horse slightly, guiding it toward the road, not looking back immediately, not checking for confirmation, just moving forward in the same quiet way he had always moved. And inside the store, Eliza reached the counter again, placing a few coins down, not at the edge this time, but directly in front of the shopkeeper. And he took them without hesitation, his hand brushing the wood near hers, close enough to matter, close enough to be seen, and neither of them pulled away quickly, neither of them reacted. They simply continued, as if this had always been the way things were done, and that normalcy, that quiet acceptance, settled deeper than any dramatic gesture ever could, and she gathered what she needed, simple items, nothing more than anyone else would take, and she turned to leave, stepping back into the street where the day had already begun to carry on, where movement had returned, where life had resumed not as it was, but as something slightly altered, something more aware. And she saw Caleb then, already partway down the road, his figure smaller now against the open land, and she did not call out, did not move to follow, because there was no need. The moment between them had already said everything it needed to, and she stood there for a second, watching him go, not with longing, not with loss, but with understanding. And then she turned back to the town, to the place that had once pushed her away and now stood quietly in front of her, uncertain but no longer closed. And she walked forward again, her steps steady, her presence fully her own, and behind her, the road stretched out under the sun, carrying a man who had changed something without asking for anything in return. And ahead of her, the town continued, not perfect, not complete, but moving, slowly, towards something better, something that did not need to be spoken to be real. And as the day settled into its rhythm, one thing became clear in a way no one could deny. What had changed was never about what she carried. It was about what they had been willing to believe, and now, at last, they were beginning to believe something different. By late afternoon, the town had settled into something that looked ordinary from a distance. Wagons creaking, doors opening and closing, voices drifting low through the heat. But up close it carried a different weight, a quiet awareness that had not been there before, and Eliza moved through it like someone who no longer needed to measure her place. Her steps no longer pausing at invisible lines. Her shoulders no longer folding inward as if to make herself smaller, and people adjusted in ways they did not fully understand, giving space not out of fear but out of respect they had only just begun to learn. And it showed in the smallest gestures. A man tipping his hat without hesitation. A woman holding the door open a second longer than needed, not making a show of it, not drawing attention, just allowing it to happen. And Eliza noticed each of these things not as surprises, but as confirmations, quiet signs that the ground beneath her had changed for good, and she paused once more. Near the center of town where the sun fell strongest, where nothing could be hidden, and she stood there for a moment, letting it settle, letting the air move around her without resistance. And across the street the boy from the barrel approached slowly, his steps unsure but intentional. And when he reached her he stopped, looking up with a kind of honesty only a child could carry, and he did not speak right away, his hands empty, his posture open, and then he held out a small wooden cup, the same kind used at the barrel, offering it without hesitation, without fear, and Eliza looked at it for a second, not because she doubted it, but because she understood what it meant, and she took it gently, her fingers steady, her touch unhidden, and the boy did not pull back, did not flinch. He simply watched, curious and calm, and that moment, simple as it was, carried more truth than anything else that had happened, because it was not shaped by memory or belief, only by what stood in front of him. And Eliza nodded once, a quiet thank you, and handed the cup back, and he smiled then, small and easy, before turning away without looking over his shoulder, as if nothing unusual had occurred. And in that, something else shifted, something that would last longer than any single act, because it had not been taught, it had simply been seen, and Eliza watched him go for a moment before turning her gaze toward the far end of the road, where Caleb Whitmore had already disappeared beyond the rise, and she did not follow with her eyes for long, because she understood now that what he had given her was not meant to be held onto. It was meant to be carried forward, and, looser, something open, and Eliza felt it as she walked past the last stretch of buildings where lanterns were beginning to flicker to life, their glow casting long, gentle shadows that no longer seemed to claim her, and she moved through that light without hesitation, her presence steady, her steps no longer measured against anything but her own rhythm. And people saw her, truly saw her now, not as something to avoid, not as a question to be answered, but simply as a part of the world they were standing in. And that simplicity carried more weight than anything they had believed before. And she paused near the edge of town where the road began again. The same road she had taken not long ago, though it felt like a different path now. And she looked out over it, not with the urgency of someone leaving, but with the calm of someone who understood she no longer had to. That staying was no longer a burden, and leaving was no longer an escape. Both had become choices, and that realization settled into her like something permanent, something that would not be taken away. And behind her the town continued in its quiet way, doors closing, voices lowering, the small sounds of people moving through their own thoughts, their own reflections, and among them stood the shopkeeper, just outside his door, watching the street with a gaze that had lost its distance, and the woman from earlier stepped out beside him, her posture relaxed, her presence no longer guarded, and neither of them spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, only something to carry forward. And further down the street the boy sat on the edge of the barrel, swinging his legs idly, his attention drifting between the fading light and the quiet movements around him, unaware of the weight of what he had witnessed, and yet shaped by it all the same. And Eliza turned slightly, her eyes moving across the town one last time, not searching for approval, not holding on to the past, just seeing it as it was, a place that had changed, not completely, not perfectly, but enough to matter, enough to remain. And she lifted her hand again, not to test, not to prove, just to feel the air as it moved, the same air that had once been filled with fear, now carrying nothing but the quiet presence of the moment. And she let it rest there for a second before lowering it again, natural, unhidden, part of her without question, and she took a step forward, not away from the town, not toward it, just forward, because that was all that mattered now. The direction no longer defined by what she was leaving behind or what she was moving toward, but by the simple fact that she could choose it, and that choice, quiet as it was, carried her further than anything else ever had. And as the last light of day slipped beneath the horizon, the town stood in a silence that was no longer empty, no longer built on fear, but on something slower, something deeper, the beginning of understanding that did not need to be spoken to be real. And Eliza walked on, her steps steady, her place no longer at the edge, her story no longer written by the hands of others. And behind her, the town remained, not as it had been, but as something new, something that would carry this moment forward long after the night had passed. And in that quiet, in that steady unfolding, one truth settled into place without a single word needing to be said, that what had changed was never the dust on her hands, it was the weight in their eyes, and now, at last, they had set it down. The night did not close the story, it carried it, quietly, like a breath held between moments. And by morning the town woke into something it had not planned but could no longer deny. A place where nothing looked dramatically different, yet everything felt just slightly out of place in the best way, as if old edges had been softened overnight. And Eliza stood once more at the edge of the street, not because she belonged there, but because she chose to begin her day there, her eyes lifting to the horizon where the first light stretched thin across the land, and her hand rested at her side, uncovered, unhidden, no longer something she needed to think about, and she breathed in slowly, the air cool and clean, carrying no memory of what had once been said about her, and she stepped forward, not into the unknown, but into something she now understood as her own. And the town met her quietly, doors opening, boots crossing wood, voices low but steady. And this time when she walked through the center, no one paused, no one stared too long, because she was no longer a moment to witness. She had become part of the rhythm, and that was the quiet miracle of it. Not applause, not apology, just belonging, simple and unspoken. And near the general store the shopkeeper set out fresh goods, his movements calm, his gaze lifting as she passed, offering a nod that carried no hesitation, and she returned it just as easily. And further along the boy waved without thinking, his hand lifting in a gesture so natural it erased everything that had come before, and she raised her own in return, not as a test, not as a question, just as a reply, and the gesture passed between them like something that had always existed. And across the street a woman stepped aside to let her pass, not out of fear, but out of courtesy, the kind given without thought. And Eliza moved through it all with a quiet steadiness that needed no confirmation, because she had already found what she had been denied, not from them, but from within herself. And somewhere beyond the rise of the road, far from the town now, Caleb Whitmore rode on without looking back, the dust lifting lightly behind him, his figure blending into the open land the way it always had. And he did not carry the moment with him, did not hold it as something done, because he understood something most did not, that the kind of change that matters does not belong to the one who begins it, it belongs to the ones who live it after. And back in the town, that change had taken root, not in words, not in rules, but in the way people now chose to see. And Eliza reached the center of the street once more, the sun rising higher now, filling every space with light that no longer revealed difference, only presence. And she stopped there for just a moment, not out of hesitation, but out of quiet awareness. And she looked around, not at the buildings, not at the faces, but at the space itself, the same space that had once pushed her out, now holding her without resistance. And she let that settle, deep and steady, before taking another step, and then another, her path no longer marked by what she had been told, but by what she now knew. And the town moved with her, not following, not leading, just existing alongside her in a way that felt right. And as the day unfolded, nothing extraordinary happened, no grand gestures, no sudden declarations, only the quiet continuation of something that had already been decided. And in that quiet, in that steady, unspoken understanding, the truth remained, simple and unshaken, that out here, justice did not need a gun, it did not need a voice raised above the rest. It only needed one man brave enough to reach out, and one woman strong enough to believe, even for a moment, that she was never what they said she was, and that was enough to change everything.